What would you do if the first day you finally touched the land meant for your future home turned, within a single breath, into a reminder that love can build with one hand while trembling with fear in the other? That morning began with the kind of light that makes people believe a new life can truly be started. The Pomelo Hills stretched beneath a soft golden sky, wide and waiting, still rough at the edges, still marked by wild grass, raw earth, and the unfinished promise of what it might become. CEO Jack stood in the middle of that new beginning with workers around him, an excavator tearing into the ground, and a plan in his heart that was larger than the barren yard before him. He wanted to turn the hill into more than land. He wanted to turn it into peace. He wanted a small worship hut for the ancestors, grass soft enough to cool the eye, and a place where Tu Tien could finally breathe without fear. For a little while, that hope seemed close enough to touch. She rode behind him on the old motorcycle, laughing into the wind, her arms wrapped around his waist, and the hill itself seemed to welcome their happiness. But joy on difficult days is often fragile. In a single terrible moment, fresh blood at Tu Tien's nose turned laughter into panic, and the dream of the morning collapsed beneath the older, darker truth that love is never only romance. Sometimes it is medicine, documents gathered in haste, hospital corridors, and a husband trying not to let his terror show. And yet the day did not end in fear alone, because even after pain interrupted them, Jack and Tu Tien chose gratitude over bitterness. They wrapped sticky rice cakes with their own hands, carried gifts into the mountain forest, and returned to the old woman who had once helped them when they had little to offer in return. By sunset, the Pomelo Hill was still unfinished, Tu Tien was still weak, and the future was still uncertain. But one thing had become clearer than ever: a home is not made only of land, walls, or plans. It is made of the love that keeps bowing its head in gratitude even while life tests it without mercy. The morning sunlight spread softly across the Pomelo Hill, touching the open ground with a kind of tenderness the place had not yet earned. The yard was still mostly bare, the earth uneven, the grass scattered, the air full of dust that rose whenever the excavator clawed into the soil. Yet there was something deeply moving about that roughness. It was the roughness of beginnings. The hill was not beautiful yet in the polished way of finished homes, but it was honest. It had not been decorated into comfort. It was still asking to be transformed by labor, patience, and faith. CEO Jack stood in the center of it all, like a man refusing to be intimidated by what remained unfinished. His voice, deep and calm, carried clearly over the noise of the machine and the workers' footsteps. He gave instructions with care, not from a distance, but from within the labor itself. He was not the type to stand aside and merely point. He picked up the hoe with his own hands. He stepped into the dirt. He showed where the grass should be planted, where the ground needed leveling, where the simple ancestral worship hut should rise. Sweat collected at his temples and slid down the side of his face, but he barely noticed. To anyone watching, he might have looked like a man occupied with construction, but inside him, the work meant something deeper than land development. He was trying to build peace in visible form. He was trying to turn uncertainty into something his wife could stand inside and call home. Each strike of the hoe was practical, but also emotional. Every sound of the machine digging the earth carried two opposite things at once: hope and worry. Hope because the hill now belonged to their future. Worry because a future built by love is still vulnerable to health, money, fate, and all the invisible dangers people cannot bulldoze away. Still, the morning moved with the strong energy of work. Men lifted tools. The excavator roared and paused and roared again. The smell of soil rose into the sunlight, and in the middle of all that motion, Jack kept seeing only one image ahead of him: Tu Tien walking freely here one day. No fear in her body, no burden in her eyes, only peace. Later, when the first urgency of labor loosened, the hill gave them a different kind of moment. The pomelo trees rustled in the breeze, their leaves catching the light in soft green flashes. Tu Tien climbed onto the old motorcycle behind Jack and wrapped both arms tightly around his waist. He started the engine, and the sound broke across the hill, like something youthful and alive. What followed was not grand, but it was rare enough to feel precious. They rode slowly at first, then with more ease, following the slopes and curves of the land, testing the rough paths, laughing whenever the old bike jolted too hard over a bump. Tu Tien's laughter floated behind him, clear and bright. She rested her cheek against his back and held on tighter whenever the hill dipped or lifted beneath them. For a few minutes, she forgot everything that had once frightened her: the busyness, the struggle, the uncertainty. There was only the wind, the engine, the rustle of pomelo leaves, and the familiar steadiness of Jack's body beneath her arms. Jack turned his head once to look back at her. The smile on his face in that moment said everything he could not fit into speech. No matter how hard the world became, no matter how rough the road beneath them, they still had this each other, holding on. It was one of those fragile moments that seem almost blessed because they arrive after too much labor, the kind of happiness people do not perform because it comes too suddenly to be staged. The hill itself felt like a witness. The leaves moved softly around them, and the open air made it seem possible that this place might one day hold not just work, but joy. Then the day changed. The laughter had barely finished echoing when Tu Tien lifted a hand to her face. At first, it was only confusion. Then her fingers came away red. Fresh blood. The old illness had returned without warning. Swift and merciless in the middle of happiness. Her face drained of color at once. Her body trembled. The motorcycle stopped so abruptly, the silence that followed felt violent. Jack turned with panic already visible in his eyes before she had even managed to speak. "What's wrong? Let me take you back right now." His voice cracked with fear. All the freedom of a moment earlier vanished as if it had never existed. Jack got off the bike immediately and helped Tu Tien down with shaking hands. He wiped the blood as carefully as he could, but the sight of it had already torn something open inside him. There are some fears a husband cannot disguise because they strike too close to love's most helpless place. This was one of them. They hurried home. No time was wasted. No movement was wasted. Documents, clothes, water, necessities, everything was gathered in a rush. Jack moved as if speed itself might protect her. Every gesture was full of responsibility, urgency, and love under pressure. Tu Tien tried to reassure him, but the weakness in her body made speech difficult. The silence between them during those moments was not distant. It was dense with fear. The hospital erased the softness of the morning completely. White walls, antiseptic smell, hard chairs, controlled voices, the kind of atmosphere where people try to remain rational while emotion pounds invisibly through every nerve. Jack sat by her bed and held her hand so tightly that it seemed he feared she might drift away if he loosened his grip even a little. The doctors examined her carefully. Questions were asked. Medicine was prescribed. Instructions were given. Jack watched everything. He followed each detail with a concentration that came from dread, not curiosity. Every small grimace on Tu Tien's face tightened something in his chest. Every pause in the doctor's tone made him brace himself. He listened harder than he breathed. In those sterile hours, he was not a man building a hill into a future. He was simply a husband terrified of how quickly joy can become fragility. By late morning, they returned home. Jack helped her inside gently, almost reverently. He prepared warm water. He set out the medicine. He tried to smile, to soften the weight of the morning, but beneath that effort lay something close to guilt. The first day of taking over the Pomelo Hill had already been interrupted by pain. The dream had not even settled on the land before fear had entered it. Tu Tien saw the guilt in him and felt her own form of sorrow. She was grateful for his care, grateful for every anxious glance, every rushed step. every hand that had refused to let her stumble. But she also felt sorry that the burden of loving her so fully always seemed to include worry he did not deserve. She wanted stability for him, not this constant testing. Yet life had given them both something more complicated than easy happiness. And still, the day did not collapse entirely, because by midday, the sky had cleared again, and something inside both of them remained stubbornly turned toward gratitude. There was a journey still waiting to be made. In the small kitchen, under clear noon light, Jack and Tu Tien began preparing gifts, not luxurious ones, not the kind wealth sends, the kind love and remembrance send. They wrapped 10 square sticky rice cakes together, layer by layer, each green dong leaf folded with care around fragrant, glutinous rice filling. Beside them sat rice parcels and simple jars of salted fish sauce. It was humble, but it was meaningful. These were gifts for the old woman who had once helped them before, when their own hands had not had enough to offer back. Tu Tien had only just recovered enough to sit upright for long. Even then, her body was still weak, but she insisted on helping. She sat beside Jack and worked with practiced fingers, folding each leaf carefully, tying each cake properly, refusing to let illness strip her of the dignity of gratitude. Jack watched her more than once with quiet pride. Love rose in him not only because she was gentle, but because she remained generous even when life had just frightened her. The kitchen smelled of leaves, rice, and spice. It felt warm in a way the hospital never could. Their hands moved in rhythm together. If fear had interrupted their morning, gratitude was now stitching the day back together. By the time the gifts were packed into a basket, the atmosphere between them had changed. There was still tiredness, there was still the shadow of the hospital, but there was also purpose again. They climbed toward the forest in the calm of afternoon. The mountain path carried them into a quieter world, where the air felt older and less hurried, where the trees stood with a solemn kind of patience. When they reached the place where the old woman lived, something in the atmosphere itself seemed to pause. The reunion was immediate and deeply human. Tu Tien stepped forward first. The word "grandma" came out trembling, and tears followed before she could stop them. The old woman looked up, her lined face brightening with a joy so deep it seemed to come from memory itself. Her hands, thin and aged, reached for Tu Tien's hands and held them tightly. No elaborate language was needed. Recognition alone carried enormous feeling. The old woman touched Tu Tien's hair with the tenderness of family. There are bonds that blood creates, and there are bonds that hardship creates. This was the second kind. The forest held their meeting in silence, as if even the trees understood that genuine kindness leaves marks time cannot erase. Tu Tien tried to speak her thanks fully, but emotion kept interrupting her. Her voice broke. Her body, still weak, seemed almost too small for the force of what she wanted to say. Jack stood beside them and spoke when she could not. His voice was low, respectful, warm. He told the old woman briefly about the day, about why they had come, about the meaning of the basket they had brought. Then, he held out the small sum of money they had prepared and said gently that it was only a token of sincerity, something for her medicine, something to show they had not forgotten. The old woman accepted it with wet eyes. Nothing about the gesture was large in material terms, but emotionally, it completed something essential. Gratitude had come back to bow its head where help had once first appeared. Tu Tien stood beside her husband with tears still in her eyes, her heart full of love, humility, and the painful awareness that she could never fully repay kindness of that kind. The day ended there, in the mountain quiet, with something more powerful than relief. Not certainty, not ease, not the illusion that tomorrow would suddenly stop testing them. The Pomelo Hill was still unfinished. Tu Tien's health still frightened Jack. Their future still demanded labor and patience they had not yet fully given. But the day closed with connection instead of despair. They looked at each other and understood the same thing. No matter how difficult life became, love and gratitude would remain the greatest strength they had. The hill could be built slowly. The house could rise one careful step at a time. Illness could interrupt, fear could return, labor could exhaust them. But as long as they still knew how to protect one another and remember those who had helped them, they had not lost the most important part of home. And perhaps that was the deepest truth hidden inside their difficult day. A future is not secured by land ownership alone, or by plans, or even by health. It is secured by the people who keep choosing love when fear would be easier, and who keep returning thanks when hardship might have made them bitter. That is how real homes begin, not when the earth is first dug, but when hearts remain humble enough to build on kindness.